secret bases, laser rifles, and an attack on Canberra are just some of the highlights to be found within XCOM UFO Defense. But as one of the first entries in the squad-based tactics genre, did developer Mythos Games strike gold or simply strike out? Welcome, my name's AZAsh and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. Until recently, I had never actually played an XCOM game before. I had played plenty of other squad-based games, but never XCOM. And then one Sunday afternoon, I walked in on my girlfriend playing the 2012 console release XCOM Enemy Unknown, which I didn't realise at the time was actually a reboot of the 1994 original. Now I say 1994, although there are more than a few sources online that suggest that the game released in December 1993, including at the time of making this video, both the GOG and Steam descriptions. Looking at high-resolution scans of the box of the Amiga version, it seems to suggest it was released in 1994, although I guess it couldn't be ruled out that there was an earlier DOS version. Regardless of the original's release, as I sat watching her play the reboot, I thought to myself, wow, this actually looks pretty cool. I particularly enjoyed the amount of downtime between combat, which allowed for several base-building elements, as well as some light RPG stuff. After spending a fair amount of time watching, I decided to go and do some research on just how many games there were in the XCOM series, and honestly, I was surprised. I knew that there were a few, but I had no idea just how many there were. You had the original games from the 90s, and this included UFO Defense, Terror from the Deep, Apocalypse, Interceptor, and Enforcer. Then you have the entire reboot series, which includes Enemy Unknown, Enemy Within, XCOM 2, War of the Chosen, and Chimera Squad. There are a couple of other spin-off games as well, but these ones form the main entries in the series. The series has also featured on plenty of different platforms, with the original alone releasing on PC, Amiga, PlayStation, and CD32. And I love the fact that PC Box lists the genre of strategy right on the box. Back in 1994, a game's packaging was one of the biggest marketing engines for it, and clearly listing this genre on it no doubt gave people interested in that genre a reason to investigate it further. Now, while I did purchase the game from GOG, I am not playing the original version, rather an open source remake called Open XCOM. Naturally, it requires a copy of the original game, however this remake fixes some bugs and refines some of the original gameplay to make the whole experience flow a little better. Oh, and it includes partial widescreen support. The reason I say partial is because of how the original art scales. It's not quite a regular 16:9 ratio, however it's pretty damn close and certainly aids the overall experience on modern PCs. I will say that I'm certainly not an expert on XCOM or the Open XCOM remake, however from the general consensus I can gather online, Open XCOM is the best way to play the game, and as of 2025 is still actively receiving updates. I'll drop a link to it in the description. The sci-fi story of XCOM is very good for a game of this time, and is told through a mixture of manual exposition and on-screen text as you progress through the game. The story begins in 1999, when UFOs begin to appear regularly across the Earth's skies, with various aliens abducting and terrorizing humans from across the globe. Recognizing that this is a global problem, a secret meeting takes place between many of the world's superpowers to establish an independent group to tackle the alien threat. This group is named the Extraterrestrial Combat Unit, or XCOM for short. The player assumes the role of the XCOM commander, essentially controlling everything from research to combat, with the goal of saving the world while appeasing the world's superpowers, who established XCOM to increase funding. Throughout the adventure, the player will learn more about the plot, often through research progression, more on this later. However, it does offer a satisfying amount of continued story development throughout the game, and overall has aged far better than a game over 30 years old should. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's build some laser rifles, intercept some UFOs, and head back to 1994 to remember XCOM UFO Defense. XCOM's gameplay is made up of a pretty simple loop, although one that has a surprising amount of depth, especially for the early 90s. The first part of this loop, which probably occupies 25% of the player's overall time, is the base building and management component. When you start the game, you're asked to select a location for your first base. You can place it anywhere, however, as I quickly learnt, You can't recover UFOs and their valuable technology that crash in water, meaning that the centre of a large continent is generally the best place to choose for the starting base. The starting base includes a host of things to get you started, including a basic squad of soldiers and aircraft to intercept any UFO threats. However, other items will need to be purchased or manufactured using the game's currency, with many things being locked behind a research requirement. Now, it doesn't take you very long to realise that once you purchase researchers, you will also need to build new quarters in your base to accommodate them. Then, when you need to store rare materials for research or building of certain items, you need to upgrade the base further. One of the things that instantly struck me about this whole base building system was that it is very well balanced with progression. Many of the first things you research, such as laser weapons and armor, two things which I would argue are the most important things to research first, take only a few in-game days to research, whereas some of the more advanced items, like motion detectors and advanced radars, take weeks or even months of in-game time. You can research more than one thing at a time, and I generally had half of my research team focusing on something important to combat, like weapons or armor, with the other half focusing on support items, like radar and power systems. You can also research the alien corpses themselves, or living aliens once you meet several other requirements, and this is the main path to unlocking the plot and learning a bit more about the game's backstory. Like with the base building, the pacing here really is spot on, with the player encountering different aliens as they progress through the game, and then being able to learn more about each of these aliens to help fill in the backstory. For a genre of game that you wouldn't think would make story a big focus, XCOM does a great job of telling it in a way that's interwoven into the gameplay. The other side of the research system is the manufacturing system. Once you have researched a new technology, you need to build it to be able to use it. Take, for example, laser rifles. Once you have researched them, you need to then manufacture the appropriate amount and then load them onto your dropship to actually be able to use them in combat. Like with the research, manufacturing is time-gated, with simpler things taking a day or so to complete and complex items taking over a week. Oh, and you can also elect to sell some of the things you can manufacture and become some sort of pseudo-arms dealer, as depending on the item they can fetch a handy profit to help you invest in other areas. Morals aside, I never really found myself having a money issue, as if you perform well in the combat side of things, the founding nations of the XCOM program will increase your funding. This might be more relevant on some of the higher difficulty levels, but for the first two it definitely wasn't an issue. As you progress through the game, you'll be able to expand to build new bases on other continents to help progress the story and increase research and manufacturing production. Like with the rest of the game, everything is appropriately time-gated to ensure you can't become too powerful too quickly. Although in a nice touch, you can transfer items between bases so long as you have the storage space or accommodation available, meaning that when starting a new base, you rarely start from scratch. The other part to the game is combat. Now, this itself is divided into two parts. Firstly, there is aerial combat. When one of your radars detects an alien UFO, you have the option to send an interceptor straight to it, or to slow the game to 5-second increments and center on the UFO. This is useful when you want to take some time to put a bit more thought into just how you respond to the threat. However, making any changes to the loadouts of fighter jets will take the standard amount of in-game time, measured in hours instead of seconds, meaning that the threat will have already left. In most cases, selecting intercept and then sending a fighter jet to meet the UFO is the only real option. These fighters can be modified with various upgrades as you progress through the game, enabling you to successfully down larger and more powerful UFOs. Once you do select intercept, your base will dispatch a fighter jet to intercept, and as long as it can reach the UFO before it escapes, you will enter the aerial combat interface. It's here you can select from a few different engagement types, with me finding that the standard attack was generally the best. Assuming you can defeat the UFO, you will either entirely destroy it or force it to crash land. Objectively, while destroying it isn't a bad option for overall points, downing it is infinitely preferable due to the fact you can then visit the wreckage site and recover items to later research and progress the story. Now, this brings up the other part of combat, the on-foot turn-based combat. There are a few scenarios which can lead to this segment, and while there are a lot of similarities between them, there's equally a lot of differences between them, with difficulty being the major part. Firstly, there's UFO crash sites. These generally vary in difficulty depending on just how large the UFO was that crashed, although overall they are probably the easiest. Next up are alien bases. These outer world designed places play a little more like a maze with a defined start and end point, although are often enemy rich. Oh, and here's something that took me way longer to figure out than it should, When you first start in one of these levels, there's a single room with a set of red flashing tiles. Firstly, I avoided them because I assumed red equals bad, although I later realised they were teleporters, so I approached them and expected to be teleported somewhere, only I didn't move. After a fair bit of back and forth, I realised that you need to change the current view plane and select that location to teleport through. Overall, these bases are probably the most linear, but equally the most enjoyable. The last kind of encounter is when a city is being terrorised by aliens, and this was, at least for me, the most challenging of the combat encounters, not just because of the enemy count, but the civilian count, who can be killed, resulting in points lost, or worse, later in the game, turned into enemies, compounding the already high enemy count. There's also a lot more level geometry within these cities, meaning that finding the perfect shot is sometimes quite challenging. Before each combat mission begins, the player gets the opportunity to select each soldier's loadout, with everything from weapons to equipment being able to be selected. Once the loadout selection is done, the mission starts, with the entire combat experience revolving around turn units, a metric used to measure everything from movement to weapons and item usage and everything in between. Each soldier starts with a set amount per turn, and you need to decide how to best use the amount they have without leaving the soldier in an exposed position. For example, standing in an open field as opposed to crouched behind cover. Once the player has made all of their moves, the turn ends and the enemy makes their set of turns, with some being displayed if within the field of vision of soldiers and others being hidden. What follows is essentially a slow game of cat and mouse as you track down and eliminate all of the enemies while safeguarding civilians and members of your squad. There's a lot of risk versus reward mechanics at play with the combat. For example, keeping several members of a squad together offers good firepower when encountering enemies. However, if one of those enemies uses a grenade aimed at your squad, you can see all of the squad members wiped out in one turn. Then there's squad morale, and look, I'm not professing to be an expert on this area of the game, and a lot of the game does revolve around learning as you go. However, if you have squad members whose morale drops within a mission, which can happen for a variety of reasons, like the team taking casualties, the soldier can then either panic and drop their weapon, using up all of their turn units in the process, or worse, start firing their weapon at random, including at their own teammates. This happened to me a few times late in combat encounters, and pretty much caused me to fail the mission. From what I can gather, if the player who panics or goes berserk survives the mission, then their morale improves as a result, meaning you should focus on keeping these soldiers alive in subsequent missions. Overall, the combat is really enjoyable. For the time, what's on offer here is great. Probably the only thing that frustrated me was the amount of soldiers going berserk or panicking even in the fairly early game, which felt a little unfair at times. But overall, the formula is very solid and complements the base building elements of the game perfectly. For 1994, the overall presentation of XCOM is very good. Graphically, the game is well detailed, with a very solid interface that helps to communicate buttons' actions without tooltips, something that we wouldn't start to see until several years later. Likewise, the choice in font design means that a lot of the text which needs reading is able to be done so with ease, even without the mod's upscaled resolution. However, what really stood out for me in the graphics department was the sheer variety of designs found not only within the base building, but the combat experience, with varied terrains, buildings and enemies all having their own unique style. You can tell about 5 minutes into the game that the people who helped produce the art for the game clearly had a deep love for the subject matter, and it really shows. There's also little touches that, while very common in modern gaming, just were not that common among this vintage. For example, when you equip certain soldiers with armor, their in-game character now shows they're wearing this armor. About the only criticism I can level at the presentation, and some would argue this is not actually a criticism, but in some of the levels set at night, the game will occasionally tell you that one of your soldiers has an enemy in sight. However, given the darkness, it's sometimes difficult to actually see where it is. Although hovering the cursor over the center of the screen will generally show you and enable you to lock onto them. As I said, it's going to be subjective if you view this as criticism or not. For me, I felt it broke some of the momentum the game builds in combat, but I could equally understand the argument of realism. Like with the gameplay, XCOM's presentation is very good and does a great job of complementing the gameplay to help keep the player immersed in the game world. When I first booted up XCOM, I wasn't expecting much in the sound department. After all, it was from an era where sound hardware was sometimes limited to the old PC speaker. Alas, for those with higher-end sound options, XCOM does offer a more comprehensive audio experience. The soundtrack, while not full of variety, is very appropriate to the setting and wouldn't feel out of place in an episode of The X-Files. While there's no spoken dialogue, there is a good mixture of effects from aerial combat to soldiers getting shot. It's certainly not a title which set any new standards in audio design, but everything is very serviceable and suits the overall gameplay loop well. XCOM is a great example of a game that doesn't explain everything to the player, but delivers a consistently predictable progression loop to allow the player to work things out for themselves. When I first began playing the game, I found the combat extremely difficult, to the stage where I was almost going to abandon it entirely. However, after receiving some advice on it from my XCOM expert girlfriend, I was able to change my playstyle and finally see some success. The most important piece of advice was simple: just slow down. XCOM is a game that rewards slow, careful planning and movement, and punishes rushing and overly aggressive play. If you have an opportunity to reach a building in one turn, you might think that the most logical thing to do is to move to that building. However, if you do this, you risk being exposed in the open to enemies in the next turn. Instead, you should look for cover, always ensure you kneel to further reduce your hitbox, and slowly approach the building in a group. The other piece of advice was to accept that soldiers are going to die. The way the game names everyone and gives them a unique avatar had me feeling like death was essentially a failure. However, certainly in the early game, there are scenarios that it is just not possible to keep everyone alive, at least not at my skill level. Once I mentally accepted that a soldier's death did not mean a mission failure, I found myself successfully completing a lot more missions. In saying all of this, I will say that I think the game has a very steep learning curve for combat, as when you first start the game, you have no ability to armor any of your soldiers, meaning one hit from an enemy will kill any soldier, regardless of the game's difficulty. I think there could have been a little more done here to make the early game more accessible, without impacting the overall experience. Alas, once you are able to research armor, things do improve. Growing up, I was perhaps not the most patient child, and for this reason, if I had played XCOM as a child, I don't think I would have enjoyed it, instead favouring something faster paced. But as an adult who has become far more patient, XCOM was a thoroughly enjoyable experience, and one that, had I have not known its initial release date, would have probably guessed several years later, which is arguably one of the biggest compliments you can give an old game. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.